Welcome to Sterling Visionary Voices, the podcast dedicated to bringing you diverse, innovative leadership insights and actionable strategies for success. Join hosts Laura McNeil and Bob Medeiros as they explore the art and science of role model leadership through thought-provoking conversations with real professionals. Whether you're a seasoned leader or aspiring to excellence, Sterling Visionary Voices is your guide to navigating the complexities of your leadership journey.
Have you ever had to choose between loyalty to a friend and honesty about a situation? That's an ethical dilemma for sure. Ethical dilemmas can be divided into 4 patterns: truth versus loyalty, individual versus community, short-term versus long-term, and justice versus virtue. With us today is Dr. Jason Lesandrini, a fellow of the American College of Healthcare, founder of the Ethics Architect and AVP of Ethics, Advanced Care and Spiritual Health and Language at Wellstar Hospital Systems in Georgia, where he leads setting strategy, implementing ethics initiatives. Welcome to Visionary Voices, Dr. Lesandrini. How does one know that their organization is ethically grounded?
Thanks, Laura. Nice to talk with you today and with the audience who will be out there listening to this in the future. So I think the best way to start answering that question is to answer it in the worst possible way, which is to tell you what it isn't. We say in philosophy, the worst kind of definition is when you tell somebody what the thing is not versus what it really is. And so here's what I'll say. I'll say that we know that an organization's ethically grounded if you don't know it from a mission statement on the wall. That doesn't tell you anything about its ethical grounding. A code of conduct nobody's read since orientation doesn't tell you anything about whether that organization is ethically grounded. I've spent decades sort of building ethics programs, ethics resources for healthcare institutions and those outside. And the thing I've learned is that you have to look at what that organization actually does to see if it has ethics and it's ethically grounded, or if it just quote unquote has ethics. Now, what tells you an organization's really ethically grounded? Probably some indicators like, does leadership make ethics a visible priority, not just a stated one on the wall, not something in an orientation manual, but how do they live that out? How do they show it? How do they communicate clear expectations about ethical practice to you? Do the incentive structures actually reward the behavior that they want? And when there's a gap between what they want and what they do, or what we reward, does someone own that gap? Or does it just sit there and people make up their own story about it? I think the real test for me, when we think about whether an organization is ethically grounded, at its core is, what happens when something costs you something? Like, what does it mean when you have to make a decision and it actually costs you something? Anybody can be ethical when it's free, to be honest. I know organizations are grounded when leaders make the hard call. The one thing that slows down or costs money or upsets other people, powerful stakeholders or community or whatever it may be, that matters. That's showing it has some value that they're leaning into. Oftentimes, it's because it's the right call for the organization. Those types of decisions, those kinds of behaviors are the pattern that you watch over the years. And I think that's what tells us whether an organization is grounded in its ethics.
How does emotional intelligence play a part of that in an ethical organization?
Yeah, it's key. And ethical leadership has been something I've been thinking about a long time. Emotional intelligence is something I hope I've just had over that time. We'll see. But I think emotional intelligence is probably what makes the ethical part usable. You can have all the right values on paper, but you know this, Laura. Ethical situations don't show up with red flags, signs glaring, I'm an ethics problem, make a good decision. It doesn't work that way. They show up as tensions, as uncertainties, as someone on your team that seems off, 2 departments that are quietly at odds, whatever that may be. A decision that looks fine on paper feels wrong to the people who are actually talking about it. I think if leaders don't have the self-awareness and empathy to notice that, sort of texture, as it were, to the situation or context, they miss the ethical moment entirely. Not because they're probably bad people. Can't rule that out, but they're probably not tuned in to see it. And so I've thought a lot about this and how ethical leadership, the training of ethical leaders, pairs up nicely with emotional intelligence and training people to be compassionate. So empathy probably is what sets that leader apart. It enables them to sit with someone else's perspective long enough to see what's at ethically stake for them. And self regulation is what keeps a leader from reacting defensively when someone raises a hard question. I know you and I talked about this 2 weeks ago during the webinar about what it means to be humble and have humility and not to be defensive. And ultimately, I think it means about having social awareness. What tells you when your team has stopped speaking up, has stopped raising values up as the reason they're making a decision, is usually a sign that trust is the problem. Now, last thing I'll say about the connection is between emotional intelligence and how it plays out in an ethical organization is that most failures, most ethical failures that I've seen in the, 25 years, are people knowingly doing things wrong. It's just not the reality of the world. I think it happens, but it's not the things that probably create the real tensions on teams. There are people who don't notice when values are in tension until it's too late. Emotional intelligence is that thing that closes that gap between not noticing and noticing in time and living out values.
What is the cost to an organization for not being ethical, for not being grounded in humility or a foundation of trust? What is the cost? Is it tangible?
Oh, yeah, there are lots of studies out there that look at this. I'm trying to think of the number off the top of my head, but I think it's in the millions. What does it cost to have someone commit a transgression against the organization or the community they serve? A lot in dollars. Oftentimes, if it's a real ethical failure, fraud, waste, or abuse, or something like that, because they thought they could get away with it. But I think even those little tensions cost us things. It cost us people and the culture, which is hard to quantify at times. But I can tell you in 2004, it was $91,000 to replace a med-surg nurse in a hospital. That's a long time ago. Of course, the dollars have changed now. That's real money. 10 nurses leave on that unit, we're at near $1 million, right? And nurses will leave for that stuff. And the experience I have working with leaders who are struggling with ethical tensions, who don't get those tensions named or resolved, leave too. And that costs not just dollars, but connectedness, history of the organization, and just a broader cultural cost that it takes to keep rebuilding when we have to keep replacing people and putting people into roles because others are leaving.
Right. It's hard to sustain a quality service
Yeah.
and care for customers. Very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point. What part does HR play in balancing organizational ethical needs?
So let me put this into context. I think there's a saying that someone once told me. I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like, when ethics is everyone's responsibility, it quietly becomes no one's responsibility. When a leader says ethics matters, everybody nods along. But that there's no one really accountable for it, it doesn't live anywhere. It just sort of floats out there in the organization. And people will think it's okay to violate the values if no one really is holding anyone accountable. Now, there is a statement that the real ethics officer in an organization is the CEO, and we can talk more about that. But I do think HR is a big player. Whether they want the job or not, they are. They're where the real pressure points happen in an organization. They see it with people, culture, hiring, promotions, terminations, whether people believe processes are fairs for violation of policy or whatever it may be. That's going to affect, and HR is going to have a big piece to play in that. I do want to say this one thing and be really clear about it. This is Jason's opinion, of course, as are all the things that I say today. But I want to say this. I don't think HR is actually the ethics officer, and we just need to get clear and be honest with ourselves about that. That's not where ethics sit. They shouldn't be treated as a substitute for one. Yes, it's a core part of HR's core function at the end of the day. So is protecting the organization. That's not being critical of HR. It's just the reality. It's the way things work. We all have jobs and responsibilities in organizations, Laura, and you have different responsibilities than I have, and other people have them, and HR has. They all have different roles, and we all play that. That's just the way the reality is. And there are things that they have to report on, and things they get measured on, and oftentimes those are tied to the organization themselves, about how well the organization is doing. And those types of things can create tensions. Sometimes it's the case to protect the organization is different from doing, I don't even know if it's the right thing, but doing something that might be more consistent with the organizational values or what the community might expect from them. Doing something that protects somebody from liability is not always the ethical thing to do. That's just a reality of the world. It doesn't matter the industry you're in. That's just the way it is. Sometimes doing the thing to protect the organization doesn't line up what the values tell us should be done. And so an ethics person, be it an ethics officer or whatever you want to call it, can hold a different kind of space. And I know there's a lot of people in the field who say ethics officers, they're not the owner of ethics. We could have a long debate about that, Laura. I enjoy the debate, but I think that role, when it's a true ethics role, not a role that's dealing with compliance and adherence to rules and regulations, but a real ethics role that has some accountability, one to the CEO, to the board, about how the ethical culture is functioning, how the organization is living out its values, how those values tensions get resolved, so on and so forth, right? That actually, I think, is a position that can add benefit to an organization, and it will work well with HR. They're often aligned in a lot of the different things, but it can also help HR as they start to navigate. I think at the end of the day, HR translates values into how people are actually treated day to day, how they get onboarded, what incentive structures we use for promotion. How do we do promotions? How do we reward people? What goals do we get to set? And I think ethics at the end of the day keeps asking harder questions that are underneath all of those. Like, when those two things separate but aren't connected, I think you get an organization that's often protected, because that's what a lot of roles do, and one that's doing good at the end of the day. When you collapse them into one role into multiple people, I think what ends up winning at the end of the day is the hat. There's a certain hat that people put on, and it's often not like, oh, what's the right thing to do? Or how do I make sure the culture is protected? It ends up being a hat that's like, how do I protect the organization? I'm not saying that's wrong. That's not the claim I would make, but we have to just know where people sit and what the default becomes for people.
Right. No, that makes sense. I'd love to pull the thread that you referred to earlier on the CEO being the ethics officer. How does an ethics officer keep the C-suite in check with ethical behavior?
Here's the thing. The chief ethics officer is really the CEO at the end of the day. That's ultimately where I think it boils down to. But the CEO also wears a lot of other hats. And so oftentimes an ethics officer is tasked with leading the stuff that we've talked about ethical organizational culture, values, alignment, lots of different things that are connected to how do people have purpose? What is the organization doing connected back to community? Lots and lots and lots of things. Okay. What I would say is that an ethics officer, in my eyes, in view of the position, isn't there actually to police the C-suite or catch people doing things wrong. I think if you do it that way, you've actually lost the relationship that you need to actually have to be effective, because the truth is if you're out there, the one policing, as it were, no one's going to trust you, right? The job is you have to be trusted enough that the C suite brings you into the room before decisions are made, not after, and that leaders call you and not late, right? Not after decisions are made, or not when it's time. And so I think about the way that I think about these roles is that over the years, you earn credibility in that role as someone who understands the business pressures that leaders are under, not someone who shows up and gives you a values lecture that doesn't do anything just so everybody knows. I don't know a single CEO or a single executive who loves being given a lecture on Aristotelian values. No one really cares about that. I think at the end of the day, doesn't mean it doesn't play out in my head and I don't think about it, but there's got to be a way to convey that back to a business leader, because executives are weighing real decisions and they'll have real ethical weight, handling a personnel situation, responding to public issues. I think ethics officers, and the type of person I want to be is I want to be a resource who can say things like, here's what it looks like from a few different angles. Here are the values that are at play. Here's what I think might be the optimal decision to make from an ethics standpoint that no one really wants us to say frequently. That only works if you've built enough trust so it doesn't feel like an accusation, but it feels like you're actually helping. The goal of everyone is the same in an organization, right? It's to live out the values of the organization and do what the mission and vision tell us, or what the point is of the organization. And so an ethics person can be a trusted resource to an executive team, all the way up, all the way down, to be the person who asks questions, but also to say, like, here's a possible answer that maybe you didn't think of, or another way to think of this situation, or another value that might be intention that you're not seeing. I don't think the accountability that you get from an ethics person comes from pointing fingers or blaming or catching people. It comes from leadership in that role. We're making sure that folks are living out the values and helping them navigate that stuff. And when organizations drift, or when leaders drift in that stuff, it's about helping them see the way back at the end of the day. That's just sort of my take on it.
Yeah, I'd be interested in your perspective. When leaders come and go from an organization, I would assume that there's a little bit of a setback on the ethical front for the new leaders to get acclimated. Because when I see an organization, I feel a culture, and I feel the culture is operationalizing the ethical framework or fabric of the organization and saying which values are important to us, whether they're written down or not. The values that are operationalized within the culture are the values that are at play. You have a new leader come in and start in a key position, you wonder what happens to the culture. And if there's multiple leaders joining because multiple leaders have left, I wonder what you've observed over the past in regard to culture sustaining beyond new leadership coming in.
Yeah, I think I have a couple things about that. One, it will depend on how deep the culture has been embedded. And you and I both know, Laura, that there's culture and then there's culture, right? And I know the listeners can't see me doing my hands, but I'm saying culture like as the broader, and then culture because your team has a culture itself that's part of that larger culture. Sometimes it mimics, sometimes there's some variation. And so, yeah, we might get some small subculture that has some variation because leaders keep changing out, but the broader culture stays consistent or the same. And so when a new leader comes in and tries to change it on a small, what ends up happening probably, and not all, I'm not 100% into this a phenomenon, but I think the idea probably would be there's going to be some small shifts up and down, right? The broader culture will shift as a result of that leader coming in, and it will also be that small sub teams culture will shift as a result of that leader trying to change and the overarching culture pushing down on that change. Yeah, I mean, culture is hard to maintain if you keep losing leaders and if you keep having people stepping out and there's new folks coming in because listen, lots of people have great ideas and they want to drive the direction of the organization a particular way. And part of the job of bringing someone on is making sure they understand what the organization stands for. To your point, Laura, there are values we write on the wall and there are values that operate underneath in our behaviors. And sometimes those don't line up. I love to work for organizations where they do line up because then we all know and have clear expectations. Now, are there different interpretations of those values? Absolutely. I've been worked with numerous organizations and thought through like what values are you trying to promulgate in the organization? And then what does it look like when you promulgate those? I can tell you a value. I'm going to give one that's probably the worst. I would never do it, but integrity. Okay. I could say integrity. Now we know that almost everybody has integrity. That's the most frequent used value in an organization. Everyone picks integrity. One thing I would say about that, little side note is, then I don't know if it has any meaning. If everybody's picking it, what does it say about your organization? Okay, that's a separate piece. But then what does it look like? What does integrity look like? There have to be behaviors behind that, right? And values on a wall and a paper and a book mean nothing unless they're actually actionized or you put a verb with them, like we are committed to integrity. And then you have to say, what does that commitment look like? Or we are committed to kindness, or we pursue kindness. Pick whatever value you want to pick. Give it a verb so you can say that it's an activity that we do. It's not just something that stands. And then tell me what are the behaviors you look for when you're saying this is the value that we have and we've said it is actionable. That looks different for different organizations. Integrity will look different for your organization versus Sally Joe over here, and it will look different for Ron. And you all could have the same exact values, but how we behave, how we make them in our behaviors could be different and lived out. There's a really good example of this. Again, I don't have my paper right in front of me, of course, but there's a really famous example, I think, from YKK Zippers. Maybe it was Best Buy, actually. It might have been Best Buy. There was a big thing with Best Buy, I think they did with some values realignment. I've seen their CEO give a couple talks about how they talked about that. Like, what does it mean to live out values? We can't just let values sit on a wall. We have to actually actionize them. And then we got to live them out. And I got to tell our team what it means to live them out. When I'm looking at you, Laura, and we're committed to integrity, and you keep taking pencils home from work, then I have to say, well, Laura, you know that one of the things that we're committed to is integrity. And you see how this value gets lived out. This value looks like we don't steal from the company. That's what it looks like. I'm making this up. This is not a great example, clearly, but we don't steal the company. And I've seen that the pencils on your desk keep depleting. Are you using all of them? Are you writing really hard, or are they going somewhere else? And if you're writing really hard with them, like Laura, and that this creates an opportunity for Laura, is there something that's going on in your life, right? Like, let's talk through that. If you're grinding your teeth in your pencils all day, like there's an opportunity for me to step in about how do we make sure we live out our other values of the organization, which are probably something about commitment to people or whatever it may be. And you can see how basically creates a warm blanket in which we engage with each other. I don't know that I'm horrible at metaphors, but like that idea of that's what our values should do, is it should bring us all together, point us in a similar direction. The mission and vision will do that too. But then how we get there, like what we stand for as we're getting there, we all should be shared in that sort of directional framework.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. You're saying approach it with humility as opposed to accusation, or a value isn't something like a hammer that you beat over somebody's head, but it's more of it's something that we should have a common concern for and a common value for. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I think the other thing I'll say, and I learned this from a colleague, this whole notion about bring your whole self to work. Okay. I'm not a proponent of that. I'll just be very honest with you. I don't think you should bring your whole self to work. I think there are things that you need to stay at home. There are things that do need to stay at home, but bring a lot of yourself to work. Like that's really important. And one of those things that you should bring to work are values. And it's not that we're trying to seek values congruent, right? We're not trying to get them perfectly matched. You'll never have employees if that's the case. You just need to see some alignment. Like the values that I hold have to align with the organization's values so that we can keep pursuing the same things together. Because when they don't align, you start to see things happen, right? I'm not talking about like people stealing and doing, but you see a lot more tensions happening. You see dissatisfaction with work, a lack of engagement, lower productivity, all the things that we want to be as leaders and team members start to get hampered by that when there isn't alignment. And so I think we should be looking for some alignment. It doesn't have to be one to one, but some alignment between our own individual values and the organization's values.
Well, Jason, it's really been fun chatting with you again. You've certainly broadened my understanding of what it takes to be an ethics officer, the role of an ethics officer in an organization, as well as the importance of values and what it means to be an ethical organization.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate it. And thanks for those who will listen in the future. I look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Sterling Visionary Voices, Insights for Role Model Leadership from the Sterling Council. Discover more and connect with us at sterlingvisionaryvoices.com.